All right, it's great to be back here with you this morning and be able to pick up where we left off. Just want to start out with a word of prayer and offer this time to the Lord. Lord, we thank you for this time where we can come together and wrestle with issues of truth. And I pray that we might be lovers of truth, ones that follow one we believe is the way, the truth, and the life. We have nothing to fear from the truth and everything to fear from ignorance or error. And we pray that you might be the one that guides us to truth. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, this issue of religion is evil is one of the unique aspects of the critique that some of the new atheists, Harris, Hitchens, and Dawkins, make. They don't use really the traditional argument that God is all-powerful, he could eliminate evil. God is all good, he would eliminate evil. Evil is not eliminated, therefore there is no such God. I mean, that's a traditional atheist argument that's often raised. But the charge is that religion is somehow or another intrinsically evil, and it ought to be ended. It ought to be eliminated, the end of faith. It'd be much better if we had no religion than any religion in the society. Seems to be the argument that we see coming through. Well, as I mentioned yesterday, the argument seems to capitalize on the 9/11 events and the kind of fear and reaction that happened to that, and then the fears of Islamic terrorism and that kind of thing is a jumping off point. And each one of the authors, especially Harris and Hitchens, focus on Islam and give significant discussion to it. And the argument kind of goes like this. They try to describe in some graphic detail more or less every abuse, and I won't say every abuse, but lots of abuses that religious people have perpetrated. And then the idea is, well, don't you see that religion is evil? Like, for instance, Christianity. You have particularly the Crusades, the Inquisition, the witch trials. And those are described in long vignettes, say in Harris's book, End of Faith. And then certainly discussions in Hitchens' book of graphic details and really awful things that religious people have done. It certainly makes my heart sink to think that Christians, people that bore the name of Christ, did some of these things. And then there's significant discussions of Islam in terms of its history of violence and the fear that what would they do if they got an atomic bomb in their hands. And certainly there's lots of things about Islam that you can put out in public and are rather shocking to people. Also, you have the Hindus. For instance, in India, there's been a lot of violence towards Muslims and towards Christians in India, and certainly that's something to be concerned about. But the argument seems to be either, it's not so much explicit, I guess it is, or implied, that it's all of a piece. Somehow religion is intrinsically evil and thus must be eliminated. Now, I'm not quite sure what the argument is if you put it on a more formal level. Maybe something like this. If there were a God, he would not allow people to do evil in his name. And Christian institution, or maybe religious institutions, have done evil in his name, therefore there is no such God. I don't know if that's quite the argument or not. Maybe it's more a postmodern type of argument that goes something like this, that religion is by its very nature totalitarian. Totalitarianism is evil, therefore religion is evil. That could be something along those lines. That's been a concern of many of the postmodern philosophers that are the phrase that Lyotard used to describe his central definition of postmodern philosophy was incredulity towards meta-narratives, that he's suspicious of any meta-narrative, any sort of larger account of the world that tries to be comprehensive. Like Christianity certainly starts with a God who's existed from all eternity, and he creates the world, and there's the fall and redemption and consummation and new heavens and new earth. And under that kind of framework, you have all kinds of answers to all kinds of things. And certainly Islam has that, or Judaism. You might even say Marxism has that. I've heard some people call Marxism a Christian heresy. I know I had a class in Marxism from a Marxist as part of my PhD program, and it was fascinating to see how parallel it was to systematic theology in terms of the kinds of answers that were given and the kinds of questions that were raised. And certainly you could make a case that Marxism is a kind of grand meta-narrative, as I think you can say that postmodernism is a kind of grand meta-narrative. But the idea is that any large story, any grand, all-encompassing story, is necessarily oppressive. And oppression is bad, and therefore all meta-narratives ought to be either questioned or eliminated. So maybe it's that sort of, they don't develop it so much from a postmodern angle, but maybe it's more that idea. These totalitarian ideas, because it's a grand story, are necessarily evil or questionable. And that seems to be the tacit argument. I never see it quite worked out in a more formal, propositional fashion. Sam Harris says things like, religion is the most potent source of human conflict, past and present. Certainly, I don't know if, anyway, I won't dispute that right now. Dawkins says, most, if not all, of the violent enmities in the world today are due to the divisive force of religion. And so the procedure, I suppose, is to focus on the crimes that religious people, and Christians in particular, have done, and then minimize any crimes that atheists have done. At least that's what I see happening in the way that they argue things. Let me respond, first of all, to something I mentioned quickly last night, but maybe develop just a little bit more, is that Christians would be very much opposed to the kind of hypocrisy that many atheists are opposed to as well. I would want to make a distinction, though, between being a sinner and being a hypocrite from a Christian perspective. All hypocrites are sinners, but not all sinners are hypocrites. A hypocrite is one who says that they believe something, but does something the opposite and pretends that they're righteous anyway, kind of knowingly going against it. So all hypocrites are sinners, but not necessarily all sinners are hypocrites. I mean, we could fall short or feel like we fall short of what we want to be and really confess it and really struggle with it, or be honest about it. Be honest about where we really do fall short of what we want to be. And the biblical perspective, or the Christian perspective, is it's not just somehow the good people in the church and the bad people outside. In fact, it's a prerequisite for coming to faith in Christ that you admit that you do fall short. All right, and so it's not just that we're the good people. We're people that are not so good, and hopefully admit it and ask for forgiveness. So we're not trying to say, no believers are trying to say that the people in the church are the good and people outside are the bad. Let me also point out that Jesus was the greatest critic of hypocrisy on record. And so when people pick up this criticism of hypocrisy, as far as they're correct, they would have Jesus on their side. You look at the New Testament, say just one example, Matthew 23, where Jesus says, woe to you, you scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, you vipers brood, you whitewashed tombs. And he was saying this to the religious leaders of his day. And I think Jesus might say that to some of the religious leaders of this day, and with some justification. You hypocrites, you vipers brood, you whitewashed tombs, you know. So Jesus was very sensitive to religious hypocrisy. And he didn't mince any words. In fact, you could say he was crucified in part for his criticism of the religious leadership of his day, because he was so strong in doing so. And certainly the prophets of the Old Testament were also critical of all kinds of injustice where they saw it, but particularly of the injustice of Israel, because they should have known better. They knew what was right and didn't do it or went against it. So the prophets spoke very strongly. There's a strong prophetic strain right through the Old Testament and New Testament, and where there is evil, it's strongly resisted. And that ought to be where what believers do as well. When they see problems or evils within the church, like intolerance, self-righteousness, black and white thinking, know-it-all, arrogant, defensive kind of approaches, believers ought to stand up and say, that is wrong. That's not of the Spirit of Christ. That's inconsistent with Christ's teachings, to follow any of these kinds of approaches. All right, so that it's hard to do sometimes. All right, because you want to be nice, but there are times where it's important to stand up and speak truth. Speak the truth in love, but sometimes that means firmly. I've heard G.K. Chesterton said that the problem with a quarrel is it spoils a good argument. You can put forward things in a forceful way without being a quarrelsome, attacking way that demeans the other person. And sometimes that needs to happen within the church about things that are very problematic in Christianity. Well, what about the Crusades, the Inquisition, and the witch trials? Well, I would say Crusades I'll just make a slight qualification there, but there were certainly many abuses that were done as part of the Crusades. I don't have any brief to defend the Inquisition or the witch trials at all. With the Crusades, I would say that it was a defensive, at least started out as a defensive posture that I think was legitimate. If you read the whole history of Islam, for about the first 400 years, Islamic forces swept throughout the world and took over much of that part of the world. Was under Islamic hands. And the Islamic armies were only stopped just barely at Paris and at Vienna. And if that wouldn't have happened, we probably all would have been Muslim, and we'd be resisting that kind of perspective. Because it was a real threat. And so that crusade started as a defensive action towards that, but there were certainly many abuses. And as I read some of the stories of it, I have to say I'm horrified at some of the things that crusaders did there. And so I certainly wouldn't want to defend any of these perspectives. But as one writer recently points out, if you make an estimate of the people killed in the Inquisition and the European and Salem witch trials and that sort of thing, the total might be 200,000. At least that's one estimate. The number of people killed in the Inquisition over about 350 years were about 2,000. Salem witch trials, about 25 killed, and that's a sort of high-end estimate. So that's the calculation. And where the evil has been done, we need to admit it. But does that mean that all Christians should have those crimes put at their feet? That's at least a questionable assumption. And does it mean that Christians do only evil? Well, certainly not. They occasionally do good, but when Hitchens comes to that point of facing that question, he says, well, yeah, they do good, but not because of their Christianity, because of their humanism. That's singularly unconvincing to me. That's very poor. In other words, there's no connection between Christian belief and behavior. Do I have to argue against that? I hope not. In any case, well, what about atheist crimes? Well, some of the atheists, these Harris, Hitchens, and Dawkins, say, well, what crimes? There are no crimes done in the name of atheism. In fact, they even go on to argue that all atheist crimes are really, in the end, due to religion. I found a little summary on the internet that goes like this of what, say, Hitchens does in addressing this issue. Here's the question. Is it not true that secular and atheist regimes have committed crimes and massacres that are, in the scale of things, at least as bad, if not worse? And here's the way he approaches it. Number one, avoid the issue by continuing to talk about all the bad things done in the name of religion or by anyone with a religious name. Two, admitting that some bad things were done by allegedly atheist regimes, but that when, say, communists were slaughtering people by the millions, they were actually acting out of a as not yet exercised spirit of religion. Three, hinting that this spirit might be stitched into our genes by evolution, so that our genes unhappily deflect atheism from achieving its glorious potentialities. Four, deflecting consideration of Hitler by finger-pointing at popes and cardinals who allegedly supported Hitler. And 5, sidestepping the wickedness of Stalin by examining the banalities of his attempts to parrot religious ceremonies. All that allows Hitchens to say with an entirely straight face, as far as I can tell, that totalitarian systems, whatever outward form they may take, are fundamentalist and, as we would now say, faith-based. And I just have to roll my eyes a little bit when I hear that kind of line of argument. But here's some of the quotes from Dawkins. Dawkins says, "What matters is whether atheism systematically influences people to do bad things. There's not the smallest evidence that it does. Individual atheists may do evil things, but they don't do evil in the name of atheism." But notice, certainly the numbers of people killed under atheist regimes. Let's say Russia, Stalin, I've heard up to 60 million, but we'll just say another number I've heard, 20 million. Mao, in one book called Mao, the Unknown Story, estimates 70 million. Hitler, 10 million, including 6 million Jews. Under Pol Pot in Cambodia, the killing fields, some 1.5 to 2 million. And that's not counting Ceausescu and Kim Jong-il and others that have committed a lot of atrocities. Not in the name of atheism. Well, I would say that these systems were, and I think Marxism is, at the core atheist in its perspective. And they did want to close churches. They did murder priests and believers. And that thing happened not only in Russia, but is happening today in China as well, on a wide scale. Nazism, there's some questions that are raised about that, whether Hitler was brought up, or at least initially, a Catholic. And he certainly did occasionally speak religious language. But he also spoke in ways that show that that was more propaganda. In fact, he says in Mein Kampf, when you hear me speak in this way, you'll know that I'm doing it for the end and purpose in mind. He really followed and took a lot from Nietzsche. It's my understanding that he kept a copy of Thus Sprach Zarathustra, one of Nietzsche's works, by his bedside table. He gave a full set of Nietzsche's works to Mussolini as a gift. He took the idea, particularly the Übermensch, the Superman, from Nietzsche. He said at a youth rally in Nuremberg, "I want to create a generation devoid of conscience, imperious, relentless, and cruel." Now, is that something a Christian would say? I certainly hope not. Does he sound like a Catholic? Well, I don't think it is. If Christians have to answer for the Inquisition and the Crusades and the witch trials, I think atheists have to answer for Stalin and Hitler and some of the other perspectives that are out there. I think the problem with both Nazism and Marxism is that without very clear fixed points or objective moral values, it's very easy for the end to justify the means. I know when I had this class in Marxism from this Marxist teacher, she was very brilliant and very articulate. She was able to really handle the questions of the class pretty much all along. There were about, I think, 70 to 100 people in the class, so it was quite good size. And she was able always to be able to really forestall a lot of the objections that were raised. But I remember this one particular class where she talked about strategy and tactics. And it became clear that any strategy was possible, or any tactics were possible, including even murder, if the end justified it. And that's one point where many people in the class started coming off the wall at her, and she had no ability to say, "No, I don't believe that." She really did. And that was a day that she totally lost control of the class. The class was in total uproar at her over this, because it was obvious that she had no fixed points, no absolutes, no objective ethic, intrinsic ethic, that would stop or resist some of these atrocities from happening. And I think that's why they did. And in Nietzsche's works, certainly he wants to go beyond good or evil. He even thinks that there is a place for cruelty to be exercised. I know Foucault, it's a postmodernist. One of his mottos was, be cruel. So that it's certainly possible, if there are no prohibitions, for that to be done. Unless there are real fixed points, unless there's something that even under pressure you won't compromise, then it's very easy for that to happen. Well, has religion done good? Well, I think certainly. And it's done because of the beliefs that are there. For instance, the origin of the women's movement in the United States started in a Wesleyan church in New York State, and Christians were as part of the core of that. Through missions, there was the abolition of foot binding in China, which was a practice that really disfigured women's feet. Also sati in India, the whole burning of the widow on the husband's funeral pyre. Particularly the abolition of slavery under Wilberforce in England. And there recently was a film, Amazing Grace, made about Wilberforce's work, and he persisted in it despite great resistance from all kinds of people, including, tragically, Christians, to accomplish that end. Abolition of slavery in America was started by Quakers and then later joined by many other people of Christian persuasion, believing in the equal dignity of people, that people were made in the image of God and therefore had intrinsic worth. As C.S. Lewis says, you've never met a mere mortal. There are no ordinary people. Lewis felt the people you're sitting next to are going to live forever. Therefore, they must be taken seriously. There's an intrinsic basis for human rights. The dignity of each particular person is to be upheld. And that ethic has been right at the foundation of Western culture and in the United States. This human rights tradition is very much grounded in the idea of people being made in the image of God. That people have certain inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that it's there as a result of God or nature's God that people have those rights. And somehow it's intrinsic to people to have those rights. They're not alienable even if the majority of society were to vote otherwise. They're not possible to be taken away because somehow or another they're intrinsic, even if the majority were to decide otherwise. Today, there are those many people really fighting in terms of human rights and injustice that are believers. There certainly are those that are atheists as well, but many people that are fighting for human rights. People like Gary Haugen from International Justice Mission that started just not too long ago, not many years ago. It started with just Gary, and now I think it's 300 people. Does anybody know the exact number of people working around the world? What Gary argues is that there's more slavery today than there was in Wilberforce's day. Isn't that a shock? More slavery today than in Wilberforce's day. Some of it's sexual slavery, but some of it's just plain slavery, where people are bought and sold. And it happens around the world despite the laws that are on the books in many countries, because the police or the authorities look the other way. What IJM does is go to those countries and really work to make the laws that are on the books be enforced. Now, I know many people here in Washington, D.C., and certainly around the world that are working on this whole issue of slavery and sexual slavery and rights and freedom, that kind of thing. There are many close friends I have, and they do it, believe in doing it because they're believers in Christ. Well, there are many other books that talk about the good things that believers have done, like hospitals, education, that kind of thing. There's a book by Jonathan Hill called What Has Christianity Ever Done for Us? It's a good summary of it. I have a friend, Vishal Magalawadi, who comes from India, and he has a whole series of lectures he's giving right now. It's going to be turned into a book very soon called The Bible, the Book of the Millennium, or Has the Sun Set on the West? And he argues that it's often biblical values have been right at the core of what's good about American society. And if you took out from under this society, some of the roots of these teachings, there's a possibility of things falling apart. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. But how about whether religion contributes to health? Well, there's been a lot of study on this issue and conflicting kinds of reports. Let me just give you one example. There's a book by Harold Koenig and Harvey Cohen called The Link Between Religion and Health, Psychoneuroimmunology and the Faith Factor. It's an Oxford University Press 2001 book. And he studies in this book 100 evidence-based studies on the link between religion and health. It says 79 of these studies reported at least one positive correlation between religious involvement and well-being. 13 found no meaningful association between religion and well-being. 7 found mixed or complex association, and 1 found negative association between religion and well-being. But it's certainly something that deserves further discussion, whether religion is intrinsically unhealthful, either physically or mentally. I think a very important issue that I've alluded to before, and I want to talk a little bit about now, is that I believe even though I think anybody, an atheist for instance, can know good and evil, and I think that's because God has given us a conscience. He has a law written on our hearts that we do know certain things that are right or wrong apart from any kind of revelation or apart from knowledge of God. It's hard to justify or give a basis for ethics apart from God. And many people have pointed this out, including atheists. Jean-Paul Sartre, for instance, is one who really resisted this idea that and you could have an ethic as an atheist without God. In fact, he has a classic quote that has caused me to think quite a bit. Now, I know it's somewhat early in the morning, and maybe I don't know how much coffee you've had, but it's a little bit abstract, but it goes this way. Sartre says, "No finite point has any meaning without an infinite reference point." It says, "No finite point has any meaning without an infinite reference point." In other words, if there's not an infinite reference point up here to judge the finite points in the world, we'll say judgment of moral values, the meaning and dignity of people, the meaning of life, and so on and so on. If there's no infinite reference point by which you can judge it and say this is really the meaning to these things, then the only other alternative is to say, with Sartre, for instance, that's one option is to say with Sartre that life is meaningless. And he wrote a book called Nausea. And he said in his play No Exit, hell is other people. Or Albert Camus said the only really serious philosophical question is whether or not to commit suicide. And we have a whole genre called the theater of the absurd, Ionesco and Genet and Beckett and others of that stripe that put forward that perspective. Well, that's one possible alternative. If there is no infinite reference point, life is meaningless. The other route you can go is to make up your own meaning, I suppose, according to your own personal preference. But then it's in the end my meaning, or you can gather a group of people around you and you can call it our meaning, but sooner or later it's a personal preference. It's something that is is our group feeling. And I think it's essentially arbitrary personal preference because there's no neutral ground or higher ground on which you can judge it to be right or wrong. So that once you give up the infinite reference point, you're left with either meaninglessness or personal preference, a kind of emotive feeling state. So that when we say this is meaning, it's essentially taking your emotional temperature at the time. This is Alistair McIntyre and his work on the subject. Says that once you give up this belief in God, you're essentially left with emotivism or personal preference at the very root. Wittgenstein, who Sartre was a founder certainly of the existential philosophy route that's still alive today in its various forms. Wittgenstein is like the grandfather of postmodernism and linguistic analysis. He wrote in Philosophical Review, 1965, the sense of the world must lie outside the world. Elsewhere he wrote that if someone could really write a book of ethics, that really was a book of ethics, this book would with an explosion, destroy all the other books in the world. All right, so that, again, the sense to the world must come from outside the world. Bertrand Russell said that atheists must build their lives on the basis of unyielding despair, that we live in a gray, meaningless place. Jacques Derrida, postmodern philosopher, kind of coming out of Wittgenstein side of things, was anti what he calls logocentrism. And by logocentrism, he means anti the idea of some kind of objective meaning to things, and says we must reject ultimate meaning or purpose. And related to that is a denial of what he called the transcendental signified, or transcendental signifier. In other words, it's kind of Sartre's infinite reference point up here that he also denies. That we can't really have meaning, we shouldn't focus on meaning to life, because there is no transcendental signifier or signified that's up here. Pascal is another person that made this observation. He said, those who lead disorderly lives tell those who are normal that it is they who deviate from nature. And they think they're following nature themselves, just as those who are on board ship think that people on the shore are moving away. Language is the same everywhere. We need a fixed point to judge it. When everyone is moving towards depravity, no one seems to be moving. But if someone stops, he shows up the others who are rushing on by acting as a fixed point. So this idea of the infinite reference point, the sense to the world that comes from outside the world, the transcendental signified, a fixed point. I think unless there's that kind of thing, it's difficult to talk about ethics in any kind of objective sense. Then ethics becomes my own personal preference, my own emotive choice, sort of taking my own emotional temperature at the time, either individually or corporately. Again, we can get a group of people around that feel the same way about certain issues, but there's no objective way that you can justify that. Another person who's picked up this theme, and I would agree with him in his conclusions if there were no God, and that's Richard Rorty. In his work, Trotsky and Wild Orchids, he talks about his whole odyssey. He kind of gives his testimony of how he arrived at his atheism. He started as a Trotskyite, really wanting to go to school in philosophy and justify the Trotskyite or Marxist perspective on things, to come up with a basis for justice and injustice as an atheist. And he ended up, you read the article, he ended up giving that up. He also believed that there was real beauty in the world. Wild orchids was something that he really loved to discover out in the woods. And he wanted to find an objective basis for beauty, that it wasn't just the beauties in the eye of the beholder, but there was something intrinsically beautiful, and there's a real standard for it. But he essentially gave up that whole pursuit after a while, and he came to the conclusion that there's no neutral ground to which a philosophical Nazi and I can repair to argue out our differences. Again, there's no neutral common ground to which a philosophical Nazi and I can repair to argue out our differences. And this idea of no neutral ground comes out of his denial of God's existence. He doesn't think that there is any ultimate basis that you can go to say, well, I'm right and you're wrong. This is intrinsically good, and I can say with any kind of certainty that what you do is evil. Now, I may feel that that's so, and I think that Rorty was a compassionate person. He despised cruelty, and he liked kindness. I think he realized that that was his preference, and he certainly was glad that he lived in the United States, where cruelty was not, by and large, encouraged. But in any case, he said that there is no neutral ground on which we can judge another culture or even judge our own culture, even though you can have your own preferences, and you can really fight for those in the political arena. All right, there is no intrinsic basis for it. Secondly, the idea of dignity. In terms of an atheist perspective, our origin is somehow or another by time and chance out of the cosmic slime. So we are of no more value, I think, than the rocks and chemicals and dust out of which we came. We could say that our origin is intrinsically worth zero. All right, and our destiny is back to the same rocks and chemicals out of which we came. What then is the value of mankind in between? Now, if our origin is intrinsically worth zero, and our destiny is intrinsically worth zero, you think that mankind is intrinsically worth zero. Jean-Paul Sartre was willing to take that direction and say that mankind is a useless passion. Or B.F. Skinner, the determinist, said that we need to go beyond such concepts as freedom and dignity in his book that has that kind of title to it. There are humanists that come along from an atheist perspective and say that our origin is intrinsically worth zero and our destiny is intrinsically worth zero, but somehow or another in between, mankind is a big plus. Now, but the question is, on what basis can you say so? There are those in the more atheist circles that say now, I've heard this quote, "A rat is a dog, as a pig is a boy." You know, that's a kind of quote that's I occasionally hear out there in the culture. What's the origin for the intrinsic dignity of plants or animals and human beings? How can we give any particular significance to human beings in that kind of system? I think that the reason, again, from a Christian perspective, that I would say that people know that in general is, again, they have a conscience made in the image of God, and it screams out to them that human beings do have worth. All right, so I do understand why people come to that conclusion, but I don't quite see where there's an objective basis for it from an atheist point of view. On the basis of theism, we can say our origin is God, who is of great worth. Our destiny is eternal life. And again, we can say that you've never met a mere mortal. There are no ordinary people. C.S. Lewis was one who wrote those particular words. And he said, nations, cultures, art, civilizations, what are they? They are to our life as the life of a gnat. That means that even though we value nations, cultures, art, civilizations, we also value the life of each individual. And he felt that you needed to actually put that into practice in the way that you lived out your life. And he believed that even people that were boring needed to be shown real worth and value and dignity. And one time, Walter Hooper and he and C.S. Lewis were sitting in a room talking about a man that they found almost incredibly boring. And in fact, the man amazed them by the very intensity of his boredom, you know. And Lewis said, but our Lord might well have said, as you've done it unto one of the least of these my bores, you've done it to me, you know. And he actually had a chance to do something for one of the person actually that they were talking about was a guy that was a librarian at Magdalen College. And he was regarded by all the people on the staff as being someone who was phenomenally boring. In fact, it came to the point where they were going to renew this guy's contract at the end of 5 years. And everybody was uncertain. I mean, because of who this guy was, they weren't certain as to whether they wanted to have him around for another 5 years. And so they ended up putting the decision back into C.S. Lewis' hands to decide it. And his decision was to keep him. And his comment was that we're all bores to someone, you know. And so that was the way he lived it out. He also lived it out in incredible ways. Like, for instance, he wrote to everyone who ever wrote to him. And at the height of his popularity, when the Narnia Chronicles were at their height, there were a tremendous amount of fan mail. And he wrote handwritten letters to every single person that ever wrote to him. There weren't computers, and he never learned how to type. In fact, he never learned how to drive a car. But in any case, he would write handwritten letters to every single person. We had a conference here at the Falls Church back a little while ago, and we had a woman who at age 6 had written to C.S. Lewis after reading first one of the Narnia Chronicles and got back a beautifully handwritten letter. I've got a copy of that in my files. It was a beautifully handwritten letter. And he wrote thousands of people. In fact, right now there's the latest edition of Lewis's letters, some 3,000 letters that Walter Hooper has put together, because he believed that there are no ordinary people. And he really valued the dignity of people. He also gave away all of his money from all of his honorariums, all of his royalties, all of his honorariums from, say, speaking with the BBC, speaking at Air Force bases, giving talks. It all went into an agape fund that he gave away all of his money to people. In fact, he had to be reminded by his lawyer to keep a third for taxes. because he was giving away more than he actually had to give. And then on top of that, he was receiving a don's salary, which was not very high there in Oxford. And he also gave away half of that to people because he believed, I think, that there are no ordinary people. You've never met a mere mortal. That people are of great value. So it does make a real difference, I think, what you believe about the nature of people. Or just to put it another way, the more atheist or humanist worldview says our origin is death. Sort of life comes out of non-life. We come out of non-living inert matter. Our destiny is death. Well, what then is life? Life is merely an unnecessary chance interruption in the midst of cosmic death. And on the other hand, the Christian might say our origin is life. The living God is our creator. He's given us life so that mankind, there's life there. Our destiny is life. Whence comes death? Death is just a very temporary interruption in the midst of cosmic life. Just puts a contrast, you might say, between the different views of life. Dostoevsky made the comment, if there is no God, everything is permitted. In fact, C.S. Lewis, at one point, as an atheist, who ended up later becoming a believer, had a favorite argument he would use against Christians, and it was the problem of evil that I alluded to earlier. And Lewis used to use that argument against Christians, and as they fumbled around trying to answer it, say, well, you're just avoiding the obvious conclusion that there is no such God. But it started to dawn on him after a while. He was coming from more Bertrand Russell, unyielding despair, gray meaningless universe kind of perspective, that he didn't have any real basis in his system to give an objective standard for what is evil. And his argument really depended on that. Unless he was just saying there's some kind of internal incoherence within Christianity, the strong form of the argument is to say there really is evil, and that's inconsistent with an all-good, all-powerful God. But he said if there is real evil, then there must be a standard, you might say infinite reference point, although he didn't use that term, by which you can judge it to be really evil, or good for that matter. A standard by which you can know that there is real objective evil. And so there's a kind of argument for God's existence from the problem of evil. There's other problems with the problem of evil as well, but a kind of argument from evil. So what I would say is that in dealing with this issue of how you know that there's evil without God, you can take one of a couple approaches. One is to say, says me. Really make up your own, according to your own feeling of what is good or evil for you. You can say it's innate or intrinsic or go with instinct, but it leaves a lot of ambiguity there because what if your instinct differs from somebody else's instinct? And what if there's a battle between these two godlets that are creating their own good and evil? What if there's some conflict? Who decides between these competing powers? In fact, in the classic discussion, when you try to talk about moral issues, people will say this: who are you to try to impose your moral values upon me? In other words, the way it's put is says who, or says me. You might be the answer that you would raise to that kind of question. A second way you can address it is the says us kind of thing, where you move it up to a larger kind of cultural contract or group idea. Now, various people have tried that, like, for instance, Richard Rorty, who was teaching a class. I had a friend who's African American, was in one of Rorty's classes down in University of Virginia. And Rorty was arguing that the abolition of slavery was achieved because the cultural paradigm in the United States changed to really allow that to happen. So it was a kind of cultural shift from what was regarded as right at one point to it gradually changed to where slavery was regarded as wrong. In other words, when a certain community has moral beliefs and principles that contradict a certain action, only then can that action be said to be unjust for them. And my friend said if that paradigm had not changed, would the horrible abuses of slavery, like the kidnapping and the harsh treatment, the many deaths on the slave ships, we'll say I've even heard 1 million people, maybe more, died on the slave ships on the way over. Couldn't we call that wrong? And Rorty said, but it did change. My friend said, but if it did not, would it be wrong? Rorty said, but it did change. My friend said, but what if it did not? And Rorty said that if the community held no belief consistent with it, I don't think we could call it unjust for them. And my friend said, that is unacceptable. And there was silence in the class. And according to his story, Rorty hung his head and said that's the best he could do. And many people in the class talked to him about it afterwards. Now, it's interesting, say, looking at Dawkins. He has a couple chapters that are very interesting on the whole issue of moral value. And he does raise the question in some pretty profound ways. But in the end, I think he does raise the question of what you can do about this intrinsic issue of good and evil. I'm going to see if I can quickly find. If I can't, I'll just talk to you about it. But I'm not sure I can find it right away. But basically, what he says is that one way you can deal with this whole issue of ethics and to find an intrinsic basis for it is the social contract. You could say use Kant's categorical imperative to will that which you would want to make a universal rule. Or another second form of the categorical imperative says treat people as ends, not means. Is the basic idea that's involved there. Or John Rawls has a classic book, Theory of Justice. I was a teacher at Harvard, and I was up there doing study on my languages when Rawls was teaching, and talked to many people that were in his class. And some people would say, well, what's all this thing about a theory of justice? Well, the whole idea was to come up with an ethic without God. And Rawls wanted to get behind a veil of ignorance and try to eliminate bias and use that as a methodology for coming up with standards for good and evil. But in the end, Dawkins admits that if you want an intrinsic ethic, something that's not determined by just the culture or a more says-us kind of opinion, that you do need to go back to a belief in theism. If he says if you want a deontological ethic, if you want an ethic that's intrinsically right or wrong, that theism is the place to go. But there is this kind of says-us kind of approach to things. Well, there's a classic reason why you can't get from the kind of cultural standard to an intrinsic ethic. You can say, well, outlaw murder because that would be good for society. All right, and certainly would be good for society because society can only be preserved if we outlaw murder. And society, the assumption is society needs to be preserved. But there's an intrinsic reason why you can't get aught out of is. That's a sort of ethical principle or axiom. C.S. Lewis says this, from propositions about fact alone, no practical conclusions can ever be drawn. This will preserve society, cannot lead to do this except by the mediation of society ought to be preserved. This will cost you your life, cannot lead directly to do not do this. It can lead to it only through the felt desire or acknowledged duty of self-preservation. The innovator is trying to get a conclusion in the imperative mood out of premises in the indicative mood. And although he continues trying to all eternity, he cannot succeed, for the thing is impossible. You can't get to ought out of is. You can't get the imperative out of the indicative. There's a classic essay by atheist Arthur Leff. It was in the Duke Law Journal in 1979. And it's called Unspeakable Ethics, Unnatural Law. And it's a fascinating essay. I recommend you get a hold of it and read it. And I think Leff, the atheist, is right here. He says, I want to believe, and so do you, in a complete, transcendent, and immanent set of propositions about right or wrong. Findable rules that authoritatively and unambiguously direct us how to live righteously. I also want to believe, and so do you, in no such thing, but rather that we're wholly free, not only to choose for ourselves what we ought to do, but to decide for ourselves individually and as a species what we ought to be. What we want, heaven help us, is simultaneously to be perfectly ruled and perfectly free. That is at the same time to discover the right and the good and to create it. He said, my plan for this article then is as follows. To try to prove to your satisfaction that there cannot be any normative system ultimately based on anything except human will. He said that the real tension is between found law that we discover, and made law. And the question is, can we find some normative propositions that would be unchallengeable? When, in other words, he said, would it be impermissible to use the schoolyard or barroom trump card, says who? Like, who are you to impose your moral values on me? And he said the only condition he can think of where the says who would not work is if you'd have to have an evaluator above being evaluated. This evaluator must be the unjudged judge, he says, the unruled legislator, the premise maker who rests on no premises, the uncreated creator of values. Now, what would you call a thing if it existed? You'd call it him. So a God-grounded system has no analogs. If God did not exist, no one can take his place. Anything that took his place would be him. So the question again is, what statement could withstand the cosmic says who? He says there are no circumstances, there's no one like the Lord. Left said if he does not exist, there's no metaphorical equivalent, no person, no combination of people, no document, however hallowed by time, no process, no premise. Nothing is equivalent to an actual God in this central function as the unexaminable examiner of good and evil. The so-called death of God turns out not to have been just his funeral. It also seems to have effected a total elimination of any coherent or even more than momentarily convincing ethical or legal system. He said, well, there's a couple responses to this. Number one, you could say, if it's not in God, then the law is in us. One of us, some of us, or all of us. You could say either we're free of God or, oh God, we're free. Each person in the end becomes a godlet. Who in the end decides between them if there's a conflict? What rules govern the interdivinity transactions? The thing that you can't do is to defend rules on the basis of the godlet preference. But what ways out of this dilemma are there? Could you count noses, so the quality of ethical boxes? You could count noses and try to get a poll for the greatest number of people that hold a particular position, but that doesn't make a result right or wrong. So you could judge by the quality of the standard, like the categorical imperative or Rawls' perspective. But there's no standards really by which we can judge good or bad, better or best. Most people have taken this more qualitative view, like the considered view, the serious and reflective view, the veil of ignorance, and that sort of thing. But Left says, in the end, he believes that there's no such thing as an unchallengeable evaluative system. There's no way to prove one ethical system superior to any other, unless at some point an evaluator is asserted to have final, contradictable, unexaminable word. That choice of an unjudged judge, whoever is given that role, is in itself, strictly speaking, arbitrary. For instance, he gives a couple instances. Robert Nozick's book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, says individuals have rights, and there's things no person or group may do to them. You could take that as your axiomatic starting point. It seems reasonable. You could probably get a good group of people around that. Sam Harris says you start with promoting happiness and lessening suffering. Seems like you get a good group of people around that. Richard Posner says start as a basic principle, no person may dominate any other. And that's okay, I suppose, to say in theory, but what happens if the person says no deal, or what happens if there's conflicts between one person that tries to dominate and another that resists that? The only final answer, I think, is to either move it to the individual, says me, or to the group, says us. In the end, here's what Left says. It's the last section of this article. It says, all I can say is this. It looks as if we're all we have. Given what we know about ourselves and each other, this is an extraordinarily unappetizing prospect. Neither reason nor love nor even terror seems to have worked to make us good. Worse than that, there's no reason why anything should. Only if ethics were unspeakable by us could law be unnatural and therefore unchallengeable. As things stand now, everything's up for grabs. He said, nevertheless, napalming babies is bad. Starving the poor is wicked. Buying and selling each other is depraved. Those who stood up and died resisting Hitler, Stalin, Amin, Pol Pot, and General Custer too have earned salvation. Those who acquiesce deserve to be damned. There is in the world such a thing as evil. Altogether now, says who? God help us. That's the way this atheist ends the article. Well, anyway, I just throw this out for some thoughts. Perhaps we can discuss it later in the question time. Maybe one final thought, though, before we conclude here, is would it really be better in the end? Would it really be better in the end if religion were eliminated? Would that really lead to a more rational utopia, a kind of enlightened society? Well, there are a couple atheists that did a study back in 1980. Ronald Stark and William Bainbridge did some surveys on college campuses. And basically what they concluded is that that people that are more religious are the people that are less religious are much more likely to accept new superstitions. Here's what they conclude at the end of their study. He says, first, it reveals that born-agains are much less likely than other students to accept radical cults and pseudoscientific beliefs. Second, it reveals that the group with no religious affiliation is receptive to these unscientific notions. On 3 of the 7 items, in fact, those with no religion are the most favorable towards occultism. Those who hope that a decline in traditional religion would inaugurate a new age of reason ought to think again. Apparently, when Christianity loses its grip on large numbers of people, deviant religious alternatives arise and get hold of some of the unchurched. By the way, this article was published in the Skeptical Inquirer magazine. So this is not from a Christian perspective. These are atheists. Here's their conclusion. It says, true, fundamentalists show high levels of rejection of the theory of evolution, but they also reject a wide range of occult or pseudoscientific ideas that may threaten the progress of human culture. Persons with no religious affiliation are often among the first to toy with novel or exotic supernatural notions and are not the secular rationalists that we might want to think them. Cults flourish precisely where conventional churches are weakest. Also, numbers of unchurched people seek private contact with the supernatural. Therefore, a further decline in the influence of conventional religion may not inaugurate a scientific age of reason, but might instead open the floodgates for a bizarre new age of superstition. And I think that's of great interest here, because the removal of religion would remove the last effective cultural barrier to mass superstition. So the new atheists are not laying the groundwork, I would suggest, for a culture of rationality. They're clearing the ground for a culture of runaway delusion. There's a quote by G.K. Chesterton that says, when people cease to believe in God, they don't come to believe in nothing. They are open themselves up to believe in anything. And we're not saying that all atheists will go that route. We're just saying that it's a possibility. No, I certainly admit that. But it is possible that people stripped of religious faith will be open, because of the religious drive, to be involved with all kinds of superstition. We're saying that that's a very real possibility, and that's not thought of or even mentioned by people of the new atheist variety. All right, I want to just touch on some of the arguments, pro and con, that are raised in this issue, and obviously this is not going to be an exhaustive discussion. We are going to be doing a seminar in January on a lot of the biblically related questions, and of course there are many of those things raised by occasionally by Harris, more by Hitchens, and Dawkins, that kind of thing. And we'll be addressing some of those kinds of issues later on. But I want to focus on, in this session, arguments that are more related, not on peripheral issues, but central issues, and dealing with, say, arguments for God's existence or arguments for atheism. And just touch on these things and make a couple comments about them. I don't have time to go into detailed discussion. I wish I did, to have time to go into detailed discussion of each particular argument. But just some thoughts and observations as you read some of the new atheist books or respond to them. First of all, Sam Harris, particularly in End of Faith. I mean, read Letter to a Christian Nation first, and then went back to read End of Faith, and I thought that would be a more substantial covering of, or more philosophical or scientific basis for his position. And I was just astounded by the actual lack of argument that was present there, and by a constant repetition of certain phrases, like, for instance, in the first chapter, that religion is free of reason and evidence. About Christians, he seems to require no evidence whatever. Another statement, every religion preaches the truth of propositions for which no evidence is even conceivable. Talks about untestable propositions. I just started out in the first chapter, and I actually did it throughout the book, and circled every time that he made similar kinds of statements that really proclaimed the utterly irrational basis for religion in general, or Christianity in particular. And just in the first chapter, and I probably missed some, I saw 35 times just in the first chapter, and it's continual refrain throughout the book. And this despite the fact that he really doesn't deal with any substantial arguments that Christians make for the faith. In fact, he doesn't really seem to be aware of them. In fact, as I look back through his bibliography, which is when I grade papers, the first thing I look at is footnotes and bibliography, and I look at the way the argument is structured, and that sort of thing. He has really very little, if any, knowledge of philosophy of religion. Maybe he lists Richard Swinburne's existence of God, but he doesn't mention any arguments that Swinburne gives or any of the observations that he makes. So I wonder if he's actually read it or just put it in his bibliography, because he doesn't really engage any arguments that Christians do. It's one thing to say that you've tried the arguments and found them wanting and then give your reasons for doing so. It's another thing to just blow them off or pretend as if they don't exist and say that Christianity is totally irrational without any evidence. Certainly people throughout the ages have put out evidences and arguments, and I think there's some responsibility, number one, to show that these theistic arguments are wrong, and then present a kind of positive argument for atheism. And that is, I think, totally lacking in End of Faith, which I was really surprised that this is the case. He does mention just one argument in a couple lines. He mentions that Augustine uses the argument from prophecy only to dismiss it quickly as trying to make their faith seem rational. Doesn't discuss any particulars, any specifics whatsoever. It's a kind of reject rather than refute kind of thing, a kind of bulverism that we talked about last night. And it seems to be the whole approach that he uses throughout his book. So I was astounded at the lack of substance that was there in that book, the assumption that he was right and everybody else was wrong, but without argument positively for his position or negatively taking on more sophisticated attempts to really defend the faith. He either wasn't aware of such attempts or totally disregarded them as unworthy of attention. I don't know which it was, but I think it's lacks something in academic integrity. Hitchens does occasionally touch on arguments for theism. For instance, he deals with the ontological argument and passes it off using an objection like, for instance, a difference between the concept and the reality that's often been raised against the ontological argument. The concept of $100 in my pocket is not the same thing as having a real 100. But this was the very objection that Anselm raised in his book, where he sets forth the ontological argument, and he has a dialogue, and that objection is raised, and Anselm felt that he actually dealt with it and answered it. as do some others. Now, whether there is an adequate answer or not is another question. But I think it at least deserves, at least going the second step and saying, well, what would Anselm say to that? Then what would you say to that? Because there are some very sophisticated arguments out there. In fact, Alvin Plantinga, this very outstanding Christian philosopher, has written a very sophisticated book on the ontological argument. I can remember in my graduate school days spending hours and hours and hours on this question. And even though the ontological argument is not my favorite argument, you feel like there's something fishy going on there. There's a kind of shell game going on that you're not quite sure where it is. And it's awful hard to disprove sometimes. The more time you spend looking at it, the more persuasive it gets. And you don't quite know where the problem is, but it's hard to point it out specifically. And it's not easy to just push away with the initial objection. All I'm saying is it's superficial to just use that objection and not go to the second stage and at least say, well, be aware of the more sophisticated forms of the argument and at least address those. I'm not saying that the argument is the best, strongest argument that's out there, but there's a kind of superficial treatment of it. Hitchens does attack the design argument, but he doesn't really give a philosophical argument or scientific argument against it. He rejects rather than refutes it. He talks about, for instance, the stupid notion of intelligent design. Intelligent design is not even a theory. He says it's well-financed propaganda. It's the same old mumbo-jumbo, and many other phrases. I won't multiply the phrases. It's essentially rejection rather than refuting. Now, he may be right, in terms of what he says, but it's at least deserves substantial argument. You need to at least say what it is and give some scientific arguments that then try to refute it. But just to try to reject and name call is not a valid form of argument. In fact, it's a logical fallacy called ad hominem, or ad hominem abusive is another way to put the fallacy that's there. It's rejecting rather than refuting. It's what Lewis called Bulverism. His major argument is one that Dawkins also uses, is that materialist evolution works. No divine plan is required. He said everything works without that assumption of God. We no longer have the need of God to explain what is no longer mysterious. That's essentially the argument, the most substantial argument I think that he has as part of his approach. And Dawkins, as I say, echoes this later, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. Richard Dawkins devotes 2.5 pages to the cosmological argument of Thomas Aquinas. His critique of it is they all assume that God himself is immune to an infinite regress, and he deals with a couple of Aquinas' 5 ways. And he seems to not realize, in making that statement, that the cosmological argument is trying to prove that the infinite regress is not possible. Now you could say that the infinite regress is fallacious, and that the objections to that to prove that infinite regress is not a possible option are fallacious. But you just can't make that observation because that's what the cosmological argument is trying to prove. He doesn't quite seem to understand it and take it again to the second level and do it. It may be fallacious, but at least take it on in its more sophisticated form. Understand the argument well enough to be able to address it in a more sophisticated fashion. He also deals with the ontological argument with a very quick observation, and he says philosophers down the centuries have taken the ontological argument seriously, such as atheist John Mackey. He says this only goes to show you could almost define a philosopher as someone who won't take common sense for an answer. And then it's sort of more ridicule of the argument. Well, again, it may be fallacious, but he doesn't try to provide any kind of serious discussion of the issue. Terry Eagleton, in the London Review of Books, says that Dawkins seeks victory on the cheap. He says his strategy is first to select a narrow subset of arguments without indicating that there are many other forms. Secondly, caricature selected arguments using medieval rather than contemporary forms. Third, give the appearance of blowing away these arguments with an observation rather than an argument, attacking a strong man or completely missing the point being made. And I think his arguments are very well taken. So much so that I think McGrath has a field day in his books Dawkins' God or Dawkins' Delusion in dealing with that, as do other philosophers. Go to the internet and see Alvin Plantinga's article that I reference, or some others, Robert Beckwith, or various others that deal with the arguments in detail. I think it's actually an embarrassment to the cause of atheism in the way that he deals with this. In fact, atheists have said that. Michael Roos, the atheist, says, "The God delusion makes me embarrassed to be an atheist." In fact, he was even willing for that to be used on the cover of the Dawkins Delusion. Again, Roos says that Dennett and Dawkins were absolute disasters in the fight against intelligent design. Of course, Michael Roos doesn't believe in intelligent design, but he thinks that Dawkins and Dennett didn't help the cause by their superficial way that they addressed things. Alistair McGrath was talking to an atheist scientific scholar at Oxford, and he said, "Don't judge the rest of us by this pseudo-intellectual drivel." In other words, a very superficial coverage, doesn't even seem to understand the arguments being made or address them in their more sophisticated forms. His main argument, Alvin Plantinga, in one of his things on the internet says, his most substantial argument is along these lines, similar to what I mentioned of Hitchens. You could formulate it perhaps along these lines. We know of no irrefutable objections to its being biologically possible that all life has come to be by way of unguided Darwinian processes. Premise A. Premise B, or conclusion, all life has come to be by way of Darwinian processes. Let me say it again. Here's premise A. We know of no irrefutable objections to its being biologically possible that all life has come to be by way of unguided Darwinian processes. Therefore, all life has come to be by way of Darwinian processes. To put it in a more formal way, in terms of more formal logic, we know of no irrefutable objections to it being possible that P. Therefore, P is true. That does not follow. That's an invalid argument. There's a great distance between the premise and the conclusion, because it's possible, certainly, to deal with Darwinian perspective from a theistic perspective, as there are. Alistair McGrath is a theistic evolutionist, as is Francis Collins and others. It's not necessary to draw that conclusion from the sufficiency of the Darwinian hypothesis. All right, we can perhaps discuss more of these, but what I was surprised by is the lack of substantial argument along those lines in the books that we're discussing here. Well, what kind of argument could you make on the other side? Well, I'm not going to have time to go into more detailed arguments, but maybe just put forward a simple one that could be basis for our meditation here without trying to provide a full philosophical defense. And it goes something like this. It's a kind of cosmological argument that is thought-provoking, at least. The first premise is something exists now. If something exists now, then something has always existed unless something comes from nothing. Again, if something exists now, then something has always existed unless something comes from nothing. Let's take on the first premise. If something exists now, if merely we exist or anything exists, then you get off the ground with this. The most basic question is, why does anything exist? Why is there something rather than nothing in the universe? Just think about that for a while. That will totally boggle your mind. Why does anything exist at all? I mean, there could be absolutely nothing in the universe. Why does anything exist? You know, that's a mind-boggling thought there. But in any case, at the very least, we exist. Then something has always existed. All right, now the question, I suppose, is between the two primary rivals for that something that's always existed, is the universe or one who created the universe. Or to put it another way, here are three options you could lay forward. First of all, nothing. The universe came out of absolutely nothing. Or the impersonal, and that's usually the universe, or the personal. Those are three options. That the universe came out of nothing, that all personality and consciousness came out of the impersonal in terms of the universe, or the universe had a personal origin. Now, considering that those are the three options, I don't think it's at least stupid to consider the third option, that the universe had a personal origin. You may reject it in the end, but it's at least a viable option that's out there. The universe was created by a being that has always existed, rather than the universe always existing. So the question is, did the universe have a beginning or not? And there are various logical arguments that people have tried. I just thought for the fun of it, I'd just mention a couple of them, although I do find that these are not totally persuasive, although they're very interesting arguments. I think that, again, you have the sense that there's something going on here that's not quite kosher, but I thought I'd mention a couple just for the fun of it. One of them is a cosmological argument, and it says that an actual infinite number of finite things is impossible. That you can have a potential infinite. We've got the sign for infinity that's out there, and that's a mathematical concept. But there's real problems and conundrums, paradoxes, that come about when you think about an actual infinite number of finite things. Like, for instance, this is one scenario that's put forward. That imagine a library with an infinite number of books. Has an infinite number of black books, infinite number of red books. You take out all the red books out of the library, how many books do you have left? Infinite number. So it really leads to a strange kind of paradox. Or there's an infinite number of books in the library. Each book has an infinite number of pages. Well, if you read one book, you read that same number of pages as you do having read all the books in the library. So again, this is one of these arguments that boggles the mind. I don't think it's particularly persuasive, but I think it's interesting. And people have used it to say, well, is it really possible to have an infinite number of finite things? Here's another argument. Again, I'm not saying that these are the best arguments that can be used, but they're fascinating. That's why I throw it out for your own interest and consideration. Think of an infinite past in time. Now, if you have, say, a train starting from a station, say 1,000 miles away, no matter how slow it goes, sooner or later it will arrive here. All right, given enough time. Now think of a train, for instance, to use the analogy, starting an infinite time ago. Now, no matter how fast it goes, it will never arrive here. So that if we go back to a time and count back from infinity, the present would never arrive. This is the sort of Kalam cosmological argument. Now again, that's it's a Zeno's paradox sort of thing, and I wonder about those kinds of arguments. At least it's an interesting one to sit back and consider. I think there are better arguments out there than these. One would be a more scientific argument. Say the second law of thermodynamics points to the idea that entropy increases. Things are breaking down. The total entropy in the universe is increasing. The sun's dated. The stars are dated. And if the second law of thermodynamics applies to all parts of the universe, and the universe has been operating for an infinite time, the idea that the sun, for instance, is losing heat and that the sun's existence is dated, that sooner or later the sun will become cold given enough time. So that we have all these concentrated bodies, stars and the sun, that are out there. Now, if given an infinite amount of time passed, if these stars have been around for all infinity, they would have been cold an infinite time ago. The universe would already be cold. It must be a time when the clock, you might use as an analogy, the sun and the stars were wound up. Did the universe, in other words, emerge with a full supply of energy, and if so, how? Well, this issue has come forward more in terms of the Big Bang theory. Back in the early 20th century, Dutch astronomer William de Sitter reflected on Einstein's theory of relativity and predicted an expanding universe. And he said if it's expanding, then it was once closer together. And he predicted that the universe has been blowing up, so to speak. And that implied certainly that it had a beginning. Einstein, when he heard this implication of his theory, was very irritated. And he invented a new force called an anti-gravity force, as well as a cosmological constant, to try to disprove the idea of a beginning. Later, Einstein admitted that this cosmological constant was the biggest mistake of his life. Later in 1920, Edwin Hubble discovered what he called a redshift. Galaxies were moving rapidly away from each other. Space was getting bigger. Space was expanding along with the universe. And scientists realized that galaxies were not flying apart because of a new mysterious force, but because of a primeval explosion. That all galaxies seem to have a common point of origin 15 billion years ago. And that somehow or another, back at that time, the universe was concentrated into a very small mass. The mass of a universe, it said, was compressed smaller than an atom. Then there occurred a Big Bang, what Steven Weinberg says the universe was filled with light, and the temperature 100 trillion degrees centigrade. Protons and neutrons formed into atoms, and gravity drew them together into galaxies and then into stars. So our matter and the Earth go back to what's called by some a creation event 15 billion years ago. Hubble's law was that the farther away a galaxy, the faster it's going away. And that would mean that if that's true, that the universe is going out at an escape velocity, and it's not likely to implode back in. Well, some astronomers, when they first heard this Big Bang theory put forward, were distressed. Arthur Eddington, who's an astronomer, said the concept was preposterous, incredible, repugnant. Physicist Philip Morrison of MIT said, "I find it hard to accept the Big Bang theory. I would like to reject it." Alan Sandage of Carnegie Library said, "With such a strange conclusion, it cannot really be true." Why? Well, because it implies a moment of creation, a certain singularity. Nothing is known about the before. Time had no meaning, thus before the creation. It borders on the metaphysical. It's something of a miracle. Those various phrases that people have used to describe this phenomena. Well, the response was Fred Hoyle put forward an alternate theory called the steady state theory of the universe that said as energy burns up, a new energy created space and time, and it's eternal. The universe has always been here. And in 1959, despite some of the earlier discoveries, 2/3 of the astronomers and physicists believed in the steady state theory. But later in the 1960s, the steady state theory received a death blow. At Bell Labs, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson discovered radiation coming from space. And if they theorized that if the universe began in the Big Bang 15 billion years ago, the radiation from that fiery blast would still be present. So they measured the radiation, and they found radiation a few degrees above absolute zero. And they predicted what it might have been, and it was right in the ballpark of what they predicted it might have been. In other words, it was a kind of whisper from the moment of creation. Later, confirmation happened through NASA's Cosmic Background Explorer, COBE, that discovered a primordial background radiation. They were able to also predict how much hydrogen, lithium, deuterium, helium should exist in the universe. Discovered it to be in line with what we find of those elements today. Stephen Hawking came out with his book that was a sort of somewhat difficult book to read, but it was, I think, 500,000 copies of it sold, rather amazingly, A Brief History of Time, that there must have been a Big Bang singularity. Arthur Eddington said this beginning seems to present insuperable difficulties unless we agree to look at it as frankly supernatural. Arno Penzias, who was one of the people that discovered this background radiation, said the best data we have are exactly what I've predicted if I had nothing to go on but the 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. Astronomer Robert Jastrow, who wrote a book called God and the Astronomers that dealt with this Big Bang theory. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he's greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. So you go back to a time when, the question, you go back to this sort of very dense piece of matter as small as an atom, and of course the question is, how did it get there and why did it go bang? And it moves you back to ponder things. And it doesn't seem like there are that many alternatives, although they've come up with a bunch of alternatives. to it. One alternative is to say that this piece of matter, this very dense piece of matter, came just out of nothing. This is what physicist Victor Stenger says. Victor Stenger says the universe may be uncaused. It may have emerged from nothing, he said. It may have emerged from nothing, a kind of uncaused effect. And I thought atheists rejected blind faith. That would totally undermine science. We have the idea of cause and effect. Or there's another argument along a scientific route that people have sometimes used, and it's been widely criticized and certainly addressed by particularly Dawkins in his book, The God Delusion. But Victor Stenger, this one that I mentioned earlier, in God, the Failed Hypothesis, said, it's hard to conclude that the universe was created with a special cosmic purpose for humanity. Physicist Steven Weinberg says the human race has had to grow up a good deal in the past 500 years to confront the fact that we don't count for much in the grand scheme of things. Carl Sagan says our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have a privileged place in the universe is something that is a delusion. Turns out, though, that the universe has to be about as big and old as it is to contain living beings such as you and me. And the question has been raised, well, why does the universe operate according to the laws that it does? Why is a gravitational force, for instance, not more or less than it is? Physicist Paul Davies comes to a conclusion different from that of earlier ones I mentioned, or Dawkins or Harris or Hitchens, and says we've been written into the laws of nature in a deep and, I believe, meaningful way. The book that really put this on the map was a book by John Burroughs and Frank Tipper called The Anthropic Cosmological Principle. They say a life-giving factor lies at the center of the whole machinery and design of the universe. Martin Rees wrote a book called Just Six Numbers that argues that 6 numbers underlie the philosophical properties of the universe. If just one of these 6, say gravity, were different, even to the tiniest degree, there would be no stars, no complex elements, no life. Rees calls these numbers providential. Stephen Hawking says if the rate of expansion of the Big Bang were smaller by 1 part in 1,000 million million, the universe would have recollapsed before it even reached its present state. Let me just mention some of these examples of fine-tuning. It says if the initial explosion of the Big Bang, this is what the kind of thing that Hawking was talking about, if the initial explosion of the Big Bang had differed in strength by as little as 1 part in 10 to the 60th, the universe would have either quickly collapsed back on itself or expanded too rapidly for stars to form. In either case, life would be impossible. An accuracy of 1 part in 10 to the 60th can be compared to firing a bullet at a 1-inch target on the other side of the observable universe, 20 billion light years away, and hitting the target. Calculations indicate that if the strong nuclear force, the force that binds protons and neutrons together in an atom, had been stronger or weaker by as little as 5%, life would be impossible. Calculations, the third thing, calculations by Brandon Carter showed that if gravity had been stronger or weaker by 1 part in 10 to the 40th, then life-sustaining stars like the sun could not exist. And this would make life impossible. Fourth, that if the neutron were not about 1.001 times the mass of the proton, all protons would have decayed into neutrons, or all neutrons would have decayed into protons, and thus life would not be possible. Fifth, if electromagnetic forces were slightly stronger or slightly weaker, life would be impossible for a variety of reasons. Fred Hoyle came to the conclusion that a super intellect has monkeyed with the laws of physics. Now, there are 3 basic ways to address these phenomena. One is the response of lucky us. Second is a more multiple universes idea, and third is a designer universe. Those have been the 3 main alternatives. And the more weak anthropic principle, or the lucky us idea, is put forward by Stenger and by others, that the universe is an accident. Since we're here, whatever the odds, the cosmic dice must have rolled lucky 7s. Okay, that's one possible response to it. But the anthropic principle does not say that given the billions of stars in the universe, it's remarkable that life turned up on our planet. Rather, it says that the entire universe had to be formed the way that it is to contain life at all. Anthony Flew, for instance, came to the conclusion that the fine-tuning of the universe is too perfect to be the result of chance. I mean, Anthony Flew has been the leading atheist over the last generation. Well, we're going to talk about that right now. He's been the leading atheist and really has some very formidable arguments against theism for many years. And he's always been, as he has said, committed to following the evidence wherever it leads. And now he's come to believe in God and has written a fascinating book called There Is a God. Now the question is, there's been a recent New York Times article that was really a hit piece on Anthony Flew that really essentially argues that, or implies, it doesn't really say so, that he's senile or that he didn't even write the book that he's said to have written. And there have been a lot of things that have come out. I actually called someone who knew Anthony Flew, has known him for quite a few years, and after that article came out, because I was going to mention him here at the conference, and I thought, if this is true, I don't want any part of it. But he told me that no, this is along the lines of what Flew has been saying for a number of years, that even though he has a nominal aphasia, he's getting older, that he's still very bright and can still write very sophisticated articles, and he's writing published articles now that can be judged on their own merit. But just to address a couple of the things that have been charged, I would say that it's a brilliant and readable book. It was recently an object of this hit piece in the New York Times. But the question is, first of all, did Flew write the book? That would be quite serious if he didn't. It was co-authored, putting together a combination of Flew's published and unpublished writings and correspondence and numerous interviews. But Flew edited and corrected and approved 10 versions of the manuscript. He actually wrote to the New York Times November 7th, 2007, which is just a very short time ago, right after this article came out, and said this: "My name is on the book, and it represents exactly my opinions. I would not have the book issued in my name that I do not 100% agree with. I need someone to do the actual writing because I'm 84, and that was Roy Varghese role. The idea that someone manipulated me because I'm old is exactly wrong. I may be old, but it's hard to manipulate me. This is my book, and it represents my thinking." Number two, Flew's line of thought is not new. Going back to 1992, he was addressing the same issues from the other side. So they're not new issues that he's come to. Three, Flew has not waffled back and forth from belief in God and then back to atheism. He's written many times about his views in a number of publications. He says that it was the evidence that led to the change, and it was not just scientific but also philosophical. There was a book by David Conway, The Recovery of Wisdom, including a cosmological argument that was instrumental in his change. The question is Flew senile? I think the answer is, from people that I've talked to that know Flew, and from there are a number of articles been written in response to this New York Times article. I think the answer is no. He has, to be sure, nominal aphasia, the inability to reproduce names, which he readily admits and admitted to Oppenheimer, the writer of that piece in the New York Times. But this does not make him senile. He can still be clear and forceful in his writing and speaking. And I would suggest that the only reason atheists raise this issue is because they want to defame this traitor to the atheist cause. That's essentially what Dawkins calls Flew in his book, God Delusion. He calls him essentially a fancy word for traitor, and calls him, essentially suggests that he's senile, rather than addressing his issues. If you want to see some of the articles in response, go to Amazon.com and see the responses that are made by Roy Varghese and some other people in response to the charges that are made on this. So you can find a number of things on the internet about it. So it's a quite interesting debate. Maybe it's given even more publicity to the book than maybe it deserves. I don't know, but the arguments are substantial. I think Stanley Fish is an interesting example, who's a postmodern writer. And Fish has an article that was written right after this New York Times perspective, and he's not sympathetic to Christianity, I believe, but he says, whatever the truth of this, you need to take the arguments seriously and address them. All right, because he believes that they're substantial and that they need to be faced. So you just can't write it off with saying the guy's senile or that he didn't write it. I think that's not really true. I don't think either are really true. But in any case, you still need to deal with the argument, whatever you think of it. It's interesting to have Stanley Fish, who I don't think is any theist, say that. So it is something that needs to be said. In any case, astronomer Lee Smolin says, luck will certainly not do here. We need some rational explanation of how something this unlikely turned out to be the case. Another alternative to dealing with this is to mention the multiple universes option. That we have maybe an infinity, or at least many universes that are out there, each universe having its own set of laws. And if this is the case, then every physical condition, every arrangement of matter and energy would sooner or later be realized. Everything that can happen does happen. And there have been various alternatives on this multiple universe, the idea of an oscillating universe, a Big Bang followed by big crunches, parallel worlds theory, or our universe came out of a black hole and black holes generating other universes. Some survive and some don't. Particularly Dawkins and Dennett like this idea of the multiple universe option. But the problem with the theory is what's the empirical evidence for these multiple universes? Well, the answer is zero. There is none. Weinberg admits that it's very speculative and there's no experimental support. Smolin says that such ideas are fantasy. Owen Gingerich says anyone believing in multiple universes should have no problem believing in heaven and hell or a way of transferring sins to another on the cross. Hawkins postulates imaginary time, which requires no past, present, or future. So you get the idea of multiple universes all popping out of wormholes in imaginary time. And if no time, there's no beginning. But again, there's no evidence for this. Stephen Barr says this: it seems that to abolish one unobservable God, it takes an infinite number of unobservable substitutes. And it goes against, one of the things that is the atheist's favorite argument is Occam's razor. If anything is there, always prefer the more simple answer, simple alternative. But to postulate unobservable multiple universes goes directly against Occam's razor that they postulate on a lot of other issues. So it's at least something that needs to be considered or thought about. Another interesting issue that I've been pursuing a little bit recently is the sort of argument from agape or altruism. Darwin once said this, that any truly other-centered trait would annihilate my theory, for such could have not been produced by natural selection. Let me say this again. Darwin once said that any truly other-centered trait would annihilate my theory, for such could not have been produced by natural selection. Richard Dawkins agrees with this and says, universal love and the welfare of the species as a whole are concepts which simply do not make evolutionary sense. At the very end, on the last page of The Selfish Gene, he notes that we alone in the universe are capable of altruism. And he mentions this disinterested altruism, something that has no place in nature, something that has never existed before in the whole history of the world. The question here is there kind of a contradiction between this selfish gene and this sort of unselfish altruism? Dawkins says we are survival machines, kind of robot vehicles programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. This is from The Selfish Gene. So the argument of this book, he says, is that we and all other animals are machines created by our genes. But if this is so, how can Dawkins preach, let us try to teach generosity and altruism because we're born selfish? No amount of preaching, I would think, could move programmed robots. Now, materialism, I think, holds to a couple main things. One, all things are determined or facilitated by physical material causes. Secondly, that all genes produce behaviors that benefit the individual. No gene produces behaviors that fail to benefit the survival of that gene, so that anything selfless seems to be excluded. How then can Darwinian materialists explain this? Well, I think there are various directions. I've spent a lot of time on dealing with this recently, trying to read things in literature. Actually, over the past couple of years, I've been working on this and talking to people that are evolutionary biologists. And here's a couple of them. One explanation for why people would be willing to give or suffer for people around them is kinship. And that obviously makes sense. That you want to preserve your own genes in your progeny or in your children, so that you might be willing to suffer and die to preserve immediate or extended family. Again, the survival of your genes would be the end. Haldane makes a quote right along these lines that I would sacrifice myself for 2 brothers and 7 cousins. In any case, there's also a direct reciprocal argument that says, well, perhaps you could be motivated to sacrifice yourself for those from whom you would expect to get an equal or better sacrifice. So that's a kind of fair trade deal. That does have some sort of survival element as part of it. Another one would be a kind of indirect reciprocal argument that you could do selfless acts so you appear good or generous, and so that you'll, even though you don't get an immediate benefit, you could benefit eventually. And basically, Dawkins addresses some of these different arguments, although not quite using the exact same terms I do, but that's essentially what he does. How does Dawkins explain this? Well, as we talked about last night, he postulates without evidence on blind faith memes, certain non-material, ethereal, spiritual entities that infect the human mind. Somehow or another, they hop from person to person like a virus. These seem to be real phenomena, not just ideas, but something that really somehow is transferred from person to person. In any case, many atheists don't like the implications of this more evolutionary perspective. When it comes down to it, though, Dawkins does admit that there is such a thing that goes beyond the kinship, the direct reciprocal, or the indirect reciprocal argument, that there is evidence, and plenty of evidence, for people that will do good things for strangers, people that will never benefit them one way or another, or that nobody will even know about what they've done. There's a kind of giving, a whole lot of actions that lie outside of the things that are very easily explainable in terms of the Darwinian selfish gene kind of approach. And he goes so far as to say in The God Delusion that altruism is a genetic misfiring or Darwinian mistake. And he uses an analogy I found very striking. He said it's like a mother bird coming back to its nest and bringing food. We'll just say, imagine worms. And somehow or another, you have all these babies in the nest with their red beaks upraised. And by mistake, while the mother's been away, there's another species of bird that gets in the nest that's not genetically connected with the mother bird. But the mother bird's programmed to just drop the worms or the food in all the mouths, including the one that is not genetically related. And that's the analogy he uses. Any love for a stranger, such as adopting a baby or giving to those from whom you expect no return, is like dropping our worms into the wrong genetic mouth. It's a genetic mistake, a Darwinian mistake, a genetic misfiring. And so the most noble works of humankind, the most selfless, altruistic works, are reduced to this genetic mistake or misfiring. Is not such an account, I think, suspect? I think that it is. It's something to pause and think about, at least. Well, I think there are many more things I can say here, but perhaps to address something of, I put together a sheet or some sheets on atheist problems. And I just wanted to give you a copy of some of my notes of thoughts that I had on various things, or things I came across in my my readings or study for you to consider on this issue. Just a couple things that to mention there. I'm sort of amazed. Hitchens raises, for instance, a lot of different issues here, but he makes a phenomenal number of mistakes along the way. Like, for instance, the Synoptic Gospels, he seems to think that these are synonymous with the canonical Gospels, whereas the Synoptic Gospels only refer to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and not John. He also talks about Q as a real book, and he says, kind of in a mocking way, how could God have lost a real book of the Bible, Q? Well, Q, some of you know, Q is a hypothetical source that we don't even know that it existed. It's the common material that's used by Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. And he seems to think that Q is somehow a real existent book that has somehow or another been lost. Another blatant error that any sort of first-year theology student would be appalled at is that the Vulgate was what the Reformers, he says that the Reformers were trying to translate the Bible into the Vulgate. If you know anything about it, it's the exact opposite of that. They were trying to get it out of the Vulgate and into other languages. And this is, there's many instances. I just picked a few. There were several articles that multiply many more issues and questions that Hitchens, many other mistakes that he makes. So if you go on the internet, you'll find many more of these issues. It makes you at least wonder, in terms of these many mistakes that are made, if he's mistaken on these things. It sure undermines the credibility of what he has to say about some other larger issues. That doesn't mean there aren't real serious questions that need to be raised or answered along this way, but there's certainly a lot of mistakes and shoddy scholarship that goes on here. I'm just amazed that their publisher didn't come up with a lot of these errors and try to address them along the way, unless, of course, the publishers themselves didn't know about some of the problems that were there. Well, I don't know, where are we as far as time? I think I'll probably pull it together here. There's much more I could say here, but I think I'll stop at this point and we'll take a break for a little bit. Let me just say this again. My purpose here has been to stimulate discussion and to raise questions on all these issues. Certainly, as I mentioned in the beginning, an honest question deserves an honest answer. And, there are certainly many problems, I think, with these new atheist books. That doesn't discount all of the valid questions that they raise. And I tried to say that very clearly last night, and let me say it again. I think it was good for me to read the books, because it raised some good questions for me to address. Stimulates thought. It's very important. Very important for atheists to read substantial Christian books. And thank you for coming to the conference here and wrestling with the questions. I think it's a good thing to be challenged from both sides of the coin and be able to address the questions that are being raised. It kind of stimulates you to think out of your box and think in different kinds of ways. All right, let me try to go as fast as I can, and Tom, let me know when my time is up, and I'll see if I can get them done. If I were to read one book on atheism, and presumably I think it's meant the new atheism, which would you recommend? I think that the most comprehensive and readable one is Dinesh D'Souza, What's So Great About Christianity. I think it's very helpful, very well written, very persuasive. So if you haven't read it, I recommend you go out and look at it, because it not only contains some answers to the new atheist, but also presents a broad survey of a lot of the issues of Christianity. I had no idea that Dinesh D'Souza had that kind of perspective. I knew him from a couple of his political books, but it's very interesting. Aren't there just as many conversions to atheism from Christianity? Stories as vice versa. Can most of these conversions be ascribed to disillusionment with Christianity rather than intellectual persuasion, which seems to be the case in switching from atheism to Christianity? I think it probably goes both ways for both reasons. I think you can certainly talk about cases where atheists have become believers in terms of the intellectual route. You have people such as C.S. Lewis as a classic example. You look at Surprised by Joy. Look at Anthony Flew and the story that's there. Look at, say, Mortimer Adler, another classic case in point of one who was a very sophisticated philosopher, very influential in the last generation from the University of Chicago, who was really not a believer, calls himself a pagan. Ended up writing a book. He and his atheist friends used to sit around and debate whether any of the cosmological arguments, for instance, could be true. And they kind of play devil's advocate and try to defend to each other and see if any of them might actually stand up to reason, just as an intellectual exercise. And he was convinced that one of them did. And even as a pagan, as a non-believer, he wrote a book called How to Think About God. And it's, although somewhat sophisticated book, it's not light reading. It's readable, I think, by anybody. It's probably in many places in Borders and Barnes & Noble. And then later, Mortimer Adler wrote a book, Truth and Religion, where he sifted out some of the different religious alternatives in terms of the issue of truth. And it's a fascinating book. I recommend you read that one, Truth and Religion. And then finally, towards the end of his life, sort of like an Anthony Flew, I don't think in a senility, he actually came to faith in Christ. So it's another interesting story. But I think there certainly have been stories the other way around. Certainly you find many people that go to university, and as a result of being confronted by intellectual issues or problems or questions there, lose their former faith and become atheists. Classic case in point, Bart Ehrman has written a lot of books, so there can be people that come from both ways. And the question is, what's the validity of the arguments that are being raised, pro and con, that each, the story itself is not finally persuasive, it's the arguments or reasons that are being given one way or the other. That's the important factor. Certainly, I think much of, I don't know what percentage, but certainly there are instances to deal with this question of people really being disillusioned by Christianity. There's much emotional pain that Christians or Christianity is charged, and there are many cases of people that I've talked to that have come not through the intellectual route, but because of the distaste they have for Christianity because of what they've experienced. And I can certainly understand that as well as the intellectual route that's present here. Why do we never learn from history? At the end of the 19th century, many educated Westerners believed science, technology, and reason would lead to a great new Enlightenment age, and it led to the bloodiest century in history. People today are still arguing that science and reason are the way, the truth, and the life. Well, I think that there's some truth in that. Many of these perspectives of trying to put together ethic without God have led to really great abuses. If you want a book length, the discussion of this is pretty sophisticated. It's a book by Paul Johnson called Modern Times. Really excellent book. It's really was a bestseller back when it came out in intellectual circles. And it really talks about the history of a kind of relativist philosophy. I mean, I think there are a few main things that seem like secularism or atheism entails. First of all, autonomy, that we are our own self-law. Secondly, contingency. Third, relativism. And finally, temporality, that we go around once and there's no life after death. And so it's interesting to see some of these things being worked out at certain points in history. How is cherry picking from the Bible not personal prejudice or emotional temperature of the time? I don't think you ought to cherry pick from the Bible. So, but maybe we can talk about this later. I don't think you just cherry pick some things you like and go over things you don't like. Were the unchurched in the study who became susceptible, unchurched in the study who became susceptible to cults and superstitions, atheists? Well, that's not fully clear. Certainly there are people that were not religious. And the question, the argument that I was making there is not that atheism necessarily leads to superstition or away from reason, but that there may be a law of unintended consequences, that if a religion were to go away, it might not lead to a grand new enlightened utopia. it might actually lead to a degeneration also to real superstition. That's all I say. It could be a law of unintended consequences that atheists need to ponder. Again, this was in the Skeptical Inquirer, and it's something that is a question that other atheists have raised as well. So it's just a valid question for consideration. How is your position on justification for the Crusades different from Harris's position on the current Muslim extremists? I think we would probably agree on that. Certainly, it's appropriate it was appropriate for Christian Europe to defend itself against the Muslims that came in, and I think Harris's position, as I understand it from End of Faith, is also that we ought to defend ourselves against Muslims as well. So I think we'd agree at that point. I don't think there's a point of disagreement there. Regarding the value of God as an infinite reference point, how do you know what God wants? How do you know which God wants it? The Christian God, the God of the Old Testament, of the Quran, pagan gods. Through the ages, people have looked to many different gods. Is it better to have any of them as an infinite reference point than none of them? Well, I suppose this is a very definitely soup question. It's a good question. I would say that the question is, first of all, does God exist? And then, is God as the Bible describes him to be? Is there any kind of independent argument that's non-circular for the authority of Scripture? Do you just have to assume the Bible's inspiration in order to believe it? I think not. I think there is a non-circular argument from probable grounds, historical grounds, to the authority of Scripture. But we'll be talking more about that kind of thing and historical grounds in our next seminar. So that's the way I would approach it. I would do it in steps. First of all, does some kind of God, a self-existent, necessary being exist? Then what kind of God is this? Are any of the revelations out there true or reliable? If so, what are the evidences you can provide for it? And is there a case you can put together that's non-circular for the authority of Scripture? And I think that there is. And again, I don't think I can go into it or do justice to it right now. But I don't argue in a circular way, at least. I try to give a non-circular case for the God of the Bible and for Scripture as well. So it's a good question. I can't fully do justice to it, but just indicate to you the lines along which I would proceed. I don't know if I can read this here. Small writing. How many atheists in the new atheism, new debate, actually believe in Dostoevsky's everything is permitted? Well, again, what I've tried to say all along is that atheists can and are moral. They can be loving, and they don't necessarily believe in cruelty or doing bad things and that sort of thing. That's not the question or issue at stake here. The question is there sufficient objective ground in atheism to resist the worst abuses, not whether atheists can be moral or loving. I think atheists can know morality. There's a morality that comes from within to some extent. I agree it's innate. We disagree perhaps on the reason why it's innate or on the grounds for it. But certainly there are many atheists that are very moral. I'd be glad to live next to my friendly neighborhood atheists, you know. So that's a good thing. Sometimes, again, I think atheists can be better than some Christians I know, or many atheists can be more loving than many Christians that I know. So I'm not putting down atheists intrinsically. We're talking about an intellectual issue that's present here. It's not the concern for the rise of the occult or runaway supernaturalism a counterproductive argument against atheism. Would a new atheist simply answer, aha, you fear the masses and wish to control them through religious dogma? Again, did I mention this earlier? That's a law of unintended consequences. It's not that the atheists that are putting forward a new rational perspective would necessarily intend that. But again, the Skeptical Inquirer article argues that may be an unintended consequence of what they desire to achieve. Does atheism inevitably lead to anarchy? Not necessarily. Okay. I'm a new graduate from seminary. Question, how much of the information spoken from the three sessions need to be preached from the pulpit. In other words, is apologetics a hobby? I mean, I don't know that we need to, that's probably why the C.S. Lewis Institute exists and we have these kinds of seminars to deal with it, but I think it's of importance to deal with the substantial issues or questions of our time. I think one of the great tragedies of the church is that very often it's so superficial. I remember one atheist that I had a chance to talk to, very sophisticated, high-level person. You'd all know his name if I mentioned it. He said he would often go to church and hear sermons, and he had hoped to hear about the really big questions addressed, like does God exist? Is there really eternal life? Is Jesus Christ really the Son of God? And so on and so on. And he said, what I found was so trivial, and I agree with that. I understood him. He was a brilliant guy, world-class thinker. And here he was really trying to listen for something substantial to engage with, and he couldn't find it in churches around the Washington, D.C. area. And I think that's a tragedy. I think things need to be addressed in a better way. One of the people, it seems, that does that effectively in New York City is Tim Keller. Really deals with substantial issues to secular people and really addresses them in very direct and forceful ways. But the only way you can really do that is to really immerse yourself in opposing points of view, and that's a good thing, I think. But then you start to see what issues are really important to be addressed, rather than really peripheral, secondary things. And I think that's problematic, to just focus on more trivial things. You said that Dawkins explains morality as a genetic misfiring, should be considered suspect, but never give a reason why. What is the reason for, I don't know, genes being suspect? My assumption is that it's because it would upset you if it were true, which is, of course, not a valid argument to reject an argument. I think the argument would be along the lines of, I think Darwin put up a condition for disproving his thesis. He said that if you could really show me a truly altruistic act, it would destroy my system. Basically, Dawkins admits there are truly altruistic acts, and he doesn't have a real basis for explaining them, but he doesn't take Darwin's challenge of something, of a way to disprove his theory. If a theory is not disprovable, the question is what would disprove the theory? Darwin set up a condition. Is that condition valid or not? If it's valid, then he's essentially admitted something that would disprove his theory. That's the question. That's the tension that's at least at stake. We can be involved with further discussion about it, but that's my question. And that's what other people that are evolutionary biologists actually raise as well. It's a serious problem. Dawkins is aware it's a serious problem and tries to blow by it. But it's a kind of gap in atheism, as is rationality, as I mentioned last night, as is the origin of consciousness from the non-conscious, and as is free will in a deterministic universe where matter determines everything. I mean, these are major issues. You don't even have to go out to the macro, like the Big Bang and the anthropic principle, which are debatable, to be sure. People that debate on both sides of that issue, but it's a major question. It's not easy to just totally discount the alternate perspectives. But there's even on the micro, the question that's sometimes raised, has God given us not enough evidence to really know that there is a God? That's a question that's often raised. And I'd say you've got it right within your own sphere, right in yourself. Rationality, consciousness, free will, morality, and love are all issues that are worthy to be considered, that are just right here. So it's something that needs to be thought and wrestled with. It's not just something that is easily blown away. Okay. How do you know that a cultural meme hasn't kept you believing in a God after you have outgrown your belief in a tooth fairy or Santa Claus? Well, from an evolutionary biologist point of view, I suppose that's possible, but then it's also just as likely that an atheist meme has kept the atheist believing in atheism. So I think and it also, as I pointed out last night, the idea of memes, or the idea of a determination materialistically undermines the reality and validity of rational thought. All right, and even this meme idea is argued by a number of scholars to do so. So there's an even deeper problem, so that the very theory that's used to argue for it could be undermined by the theory itself. It's self-refuting, self-contradictory. Hitchens often cites the story of the Good Samaritan as an example of the non-necessity of religion, since it was the non-religious person rather than the religious ones who showed mercy. How would you respond? Well, I think it's certainly true that he picks a Samaritan. And I think because he was trying to expose the religious establishment of his day and their kind of hypocrisy. But it's certainly Jesus that teaches the story and argues that your neighbor is beyond those people that you normally think. The whole debate back in Judaism was who is the neighbor. And there were many rabbis that said that Gentiles and Samaritans and such people were not your neighbor. And therefore, if you were to find them lying by the road, you should not help them, because if you make them stronger, they might actually kill you or do something against you later on. So just leave them there. Your neighbor was your fellow religious people. Jesus was countering that idea. And he did it in a way that was provocative, I think, to the Pharisees and religious leaders that he was telling the story to the lawyer who had this view of neighbor that perhaps was like many in that contemporary society. So he picks the most unlikely person, the person that was hated perhaps more than the unbelievers, like the Gentiles, or Samaritans, or religious heretics, and there was much hatred towards them. So that Jesus is putting the sword in on this particular issue to really challenge some of the accepted assumptions of the time. If you advise to throw out all of Dawkins, Hitchens, and Dennett, Harris, if one finds something suspect, then would the same standard apply to the Bible or other theological texts? I hope I haven't given the impression that I would throw out everything of Dawkins, Dennett, and Harris. I think there are valid questions being raised. I've tried to challenge some of the things that I think are shoddy or unreliable in their thinking. But I certainly wouldn't want to throw out all the questions as being invalid. I think, as a matter of fact, many of them are valid. Many of the points that are raised are ones that have caused me to consider, and I think ought to cause all Christians to sit back and ponder. So I hope that they would, atheists would do that with Christian writers, as well as certainly I would want to do it. And I've tried to make that clear, but let me make it clear one more time here. I don't think I can do this one. Can you define ontological argument, cosmological, infinite regress? I think we'll have to wait on that. Because it would take too long. Not that I would not like to do it, but each one of those would take an hour course to do justice to it. How effective is apologetics as against other methods in making new believers and helping them grow in discipleship and Christ-like living? Well, I think it's a value to, it's hard for the heart to embrace what the mind cannot accept. And if people are asking intellectual questions, they need to be given intellectual answers. Again, an honest question deserves an honest answer. And if you're going to be able to speak to people that are thinking about some of the issues or questions that are raised by the new atheists, I think they need to be addressed and addressed fairly. So that's my assumption there. In regards to the anthropic principle of universal origin, are we evolved, oh boy, as, I don't know if I can read it here, as we are, because of the universe we exist in, no creator involved / merely evolving within the environment present. I don't know if I can understand the question there. I'll have to go on to another one. I don't want to avoid it, but I can't really get it there. Besides 9/11, do you believe these attacks by Dawkins, Hitchens, and Harris could be in response to the progress in the acceptance of intelligent design? Possibly. Certainly they're opposed to the intelligent design arguments or arguments against the theory of evolution, and thus wanting to put forward another perspective to it. How do you encounter that the argument that the Bible is simply made up? Well, you go back to the idea of the historicity say, of the Bible, particularly, say, of the Gospels. That's what we're going to look at the next seminar. So if you want to come and face that and deal with that, then come to the next seminar on the real Jesus. And we'll look particularly at the Gospels, but we could look at some of the higher criticism of the Old and New Testament. But just to give you a little perspective, I went to Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, which was a quite liberal theological seminary. And I found everything that I had believed coming up as a believer when I grew up being attacked by professors in a theological seminary, including the reality of a personal God, the Trinity, the deity of Christ, the sinlessness of Jesus, the atonement of Christ on the cross, resurrection, the ascension, the authority of Scripture, all attacked in a Presbyterian theological seminary. And I would say that people in that seminary know how to attack those things much more effectively than most New Agers or atheists ever do, because they're very sophisticated. They really know what they're doing. They make a professional, full-time job doing it. And I went through 10 years of dealing with that. Now, those 10 years were painful sometimes. And I have to admit, I did have real doubts and struggles as questions were raised that I didn't have immediate answers to. But I learned to live in some of that tension, and after a while, I did, I think, come to answers that were satisfying. So that the idea of pursuing antagonistic questions is not alien to me, and it's something that I value and want to do. I do think that I want to follow the evidence where it leads and be able to address honest questions with honest answers. But I've been through that, at least for 10 years. Through my Master of Divinity and through my PhD years, I also had a study carrel at that same seminary and had, toward the end of the time, many long discussions with some of the professors I had very early in my time that in terms of Old Testament criticism, in terms of New Testament criticism, in terms of the Gospels, people like the Jesus Seminar and that sort of thing, people like Bart Ehrman, or dime a dozen there. And so I had to face a lot of their detailed objections. It took me about 10 years to come to solid answers, what I think are solid answers to those questions. And then I engaged some of the people that were the leading proponents of these. We had hours of discussion on those subjects. So it's not something that I want to avoid. I think there are solid answers to the questions, but it's hard to give 10 years worth of study and wrestling in a few seconds, you know. Whom were you quoting, and from what, when you said that you need an unexaminable examiner? That was from Arthur Leff, an atheist. He was an atheist law professor from Yale University, and he wrote that article in the Duke Law Review, Unspeakable Ethics, Unnatural Laws, Duke Law Review, 1979. That was, again, was an atheist law professor from Yale University, Yale Law School. Are postmodern Christian apologists like Alistair McGrath understating the case for Christianity? I don't know that I want to fully address that issue. I mean, there are various views on the role of faith and reason that go within the Christian community. I think it seems that the portrayal of Harris, Hitchens, and Dawkins is that all of the people are like backwoods fundamentalists that put their head in the sand at the sound of any questions. But of course, there are many others that have very sophisticated defenses of fideism, really starting with the idea of faith in a very sophisticated way. And then there are various views of faith and reason that are out there in the Christian community. And I don't think we can settle all that. If you want some discussion of this issue, there's a book by a guy from Denver Seminary. I'm trying to remember. Oh, well. I'll try to think of it later, huh? Craig Blomberg is at Denver, but it's another Grutheis, Douglas Grutheis, Truth Decay, that discusses a lot of the different approaches to truth in the Christian community. And he also discusses Alistair McGrath in that book, Truth Decay, Douglas Grutheis. Dr. Lindsley, it sounds like reason alone cannot establish any moral system, as though reason by itself is an inadequate tool, like trying to change a flat tire with a toothbrush. comment. I don't know if I can quickly address that question. I think reason alone, what Arthur Leff argues is that there's no system of ethics that can be formulated on anything other than the human will, if you leave out God. And I don't think I can go back and repeat all the things that I said here in terms of that answer. All right, sorry. I tried to go, actually, I didn't put an order to these. I just tried to go through them as best I could, and I wish I could, if I had another half hour, I could probably go through the rest of these questions, and I'd be glad to do it.